Touchdown pass.
Peyton bounces around, throws. The ball will be caught. Julius Thomas, touchdown, Denver.
What's up, guys? On this segment of Beyond the Sport, I'm going to be breaking down the NHL playoff proposal, which involves a 24-team playoff. This has recently been successfully passed by the NHL Players Association this week. This is huge significance for not only the NHL, but all sports, as this is a huge step in the right direction. So, without further ado, let's get into it. First things first, with this proposal, it is said to be a 24-team playoff, but I have to just notify before getting into the actual details of the proposal itself, it's not truly a 24-team playoff. We're not going to see that many teams in the same playoff bracket format that we're accustomed to seeing with the 16 teams, 8 from the Western and 8 from the Eastern Conference. Instead, it's 12 and 12, but what makes this different, why it's not really considered an actual playoff spot for the teams that have been placed into this should the season return, the biggest difference is that the 5 through 12 seeds will take on each other because those are considered the more borderline teams that haven't solidified themselves as one of those top contending threats to win the cup, as the 1 through 4 seeds that have already established themselves as a team that were guaranteed, in essence, I'm sure Money Puck would also approve it on their website, that these teams were guaranteed to make the playoffs. So what they're doing with this is to replace the regular season, or the remainder of it, I should say, being that there was about 15 to 20 games left before the playoffs were actually going to start after the regular 82 games that we are supposed to see each season. Instead of that, they're going to reduce the time that it would take to play those games by having a play-in series between these more borderline teams that are fighting for spots near the end of the season as it is. And it seemed like a more fitting way to be rather efficient with the games that they play, especially being that they had to change scheduling, and they didn't want to have to do that being that they're already midway through the season. They wanted to just be able to jump straight into the thick of things in their considered playoff format, even though it's not technically. That's how they're categorizing it as these teams are going to battle it out to eventually play in what will be the legitimate first round of the teams that have already had technically their first round buys. And I just have to disclaim, I keep throwing the word technically, these air quotes, all these different things, but that's like the only way to do it because of the fact that it's not actually, the right terminology for the circumstance, because when you look at something like this, you think the 1 through 4 seeds, they have these buys, and it's like, well, one, we're not accustomed to seeing that in the NHL playoff format. You may see it like in the NFL for a good example to point to, where you see these teams, the top 2 seeds, where they've earned their spot, in this case 4 teams, where they don't have to play and other teams are going to play to battle to eventually play them in that next round. But in this circumstance, by the time that it's all figured out between the 5 through 12 seeds, and the seeding is rearranged and determined based on who the 1 seed's going to play, who the 2, the 3, and the 4 are going to play, at that point, that's when the official playoffs will actually kick off, and we're going to get some more legitimate matchups. So I had to get that off the top before I truly got into the video. So I guess you could say without further ado, here we get into it. But I'm going to be breaking down all the intricacies and all the different things that were included in this proposal. First thing to point out with this, the regular season would therefore be eliminated should the season return. Obviously, that's the big question mark that remains. But if there is going to be a return to the season under this proposal and the format that they have in place with this, then what that would mean is there's no regular season games. They made this decision so that they could efficiently eliminate those remaining games on the schedule, being that there's complications with where teams have to travel and play. They didn't want to have to deal with that, and I think that that was the right move ultimately. But that was the thought process with this. They wanted to do it in a more efficient manner, in a way that they thought was fair. Obviously, the players thought it was fair. They were on board, and that would mean that since there are 24 teams that will be continuing to play the game, that would mean the remaining 7 would therefore be eliminated from contention and will not be playing any games when the season hopefully returns at some point. Here is the format right here for what we are projected to see should the season return, being that there aren't going to be any other regular season games that could shake this up. This is what we would get should the season eventually return. The second point is how these teams are split up in both the Western and Eastern Conference, for the teams that are going to battle it out to eventually make it out of their conference to compete for a Stanley Cup Finals versus the other conference. And instead of the 8-8 for both conferences, it would be 12-12. And with this, like I mentioned earlier, the 1 through 4 seeds would have what's considered a bye in this scenario, where they await the 5 through 12 seeds who battle it out to then play them. And their teams that were the consensus top level teams, they had such a good record up until this point in the season that with this proposal in place, they felt confident that these are the 4 teams from both conferences that weren't going to miss out on a playoff spot. They were all but guaranteed it. Some had already clinched that or were very close to doing so. It seemed like a given that they were going to get that. So that's how they've been rewarded for the work that they've put in for the regular season, that they did have the games to play. So that's how it's going to work for both conferences. And one of the matchups that I was able to take a look at that people were pointing out is the 5-seed Pittsburgh Penguins versus the 12-seed Montreal Canadiens. And people are just going crazy. All the fans are thinking all it takes is Carey Price getting hot in the net, and all of a sudden he performs well in the series that they're going to play, and they could steal what would have been all but guaranteed as a playoff spot to those Pittsburgh Penguins in a regular playoff scenario. So it's a really interesting thing to look at, to see all these little intricacies, all these different, storylines as to how these teams are being matched up against each other, when we would have seen vastly different playoff matchups had we seen the regular format. Positives of this: obviously this is a return to play. That's a positive in itself. I think that goes without saying. But the big thing is the players are on board. And I made a comparison to this to the MLB and how they've had many proposals, one of which was sent through to the Players Union, and the MLB players are not on board. There's a lot of turmoil currently between them and the owners. They're not in agreement of the salary reductions as a result of their season not even beginning and having a reduced season from their 162 all the way down to 82. This is something that I know a lot of MLB players are very frustrated with. They don't like the information involving the proposal was leaked, and there's a lot of bad stuff going on in the MLB that's grinding that proposal to a halt after it was picking up some speed, and that's a very different scenario with the NHL, and I think that's such a good thing for the league because the players are on board. And I will have to just, point out the fact that this is a different scenario because they've already played a large sum of their regular season games, and ratio-wise, how it stacks up to the games that their contract applies to in 82, the fact that they've played between 60 and 70 games, that's a very different scenario. They've played a majority of their games, and they're going to have a different play-in format that's going to result in more games leading to the actual playoffs itself. So I don't want to just make one comparison and completely ignore that, but it is something to note because this was something that went through immediately. As soon as this proposal went out, the players were on board, and I think that that's a big sign for this being an opportunity that we could actually see a realistic option coming out of. Locations are yet to be known. The NHL and Commissioner Gary Bettman have not made that decision. They do not know what is going to take place and where these games are going to be played. As far as having neutral sites, of course, the plan would involve not having fans like all sports and all their agendas as far as getting back to playing the game itself. There would be no fans in attendance, and they're just not too sure where they're going to play these games. There's been a ton of rumors. I know North Dakota was a hot rumor a couple weeks ago, but that just shows a clear-cut example of the fact that these things change. Over time, day by day, even hour by hour, these are a very fluid situation in which we are seeing plans change in a split second. So really nothing to report as far as locations. They've been exploring a lot of different options for sites that they could play, but there's nothing that is concrete in this proposal. That's one of those factors that they're going to have to determine at some point should the season eventually have a clear chance to return. My biggest takeaway from all this is the fact that this gives new life to some of these teams that weren't going to make the playoffs in all likelihood should they have had a regular scenario where there was no postponement of the regular season and we had a regular playoff format. With this, you see teams like the 9, the 10, 11, and the 12 seeds. These are teams that definitely those 11 and 12 seeds probably didn't make the playoffs in a regular scenario based on the limited amount of games that they had to cover ground and pass up these other wildcard teams for a spot to make it to the postseason. But these are teams all of a sudden, there's new life. They get to play. They're going to be back on the ice. There's going to be a fire lit in these guys' stomachs. They know they have a chance to do something special. This is obviously a strange year, and I think that no matter what comes out of this, there could be an asterisk next to the name of the team that wins the Stanley Cup this year should the season return. But you think the players are thinking that? No. They are ready. They're going to approach it like it's the start of the regular season because a huge thing with this is guys are able to get healthy. Montreal Canadiens were a 12 seed matched up against the Pens in this scenario as the 5 seed that I pointed out as a game of huge interest, because that's a team that only won 17 games in regulation. They have some talented players. They got Carey Price to rely on. That's a guy that any given series could lock in and really make it difficult for a team like the Penguins. And that's a team that all of a sudden has a new purpose. They have a new drive. And I think that this can really shake things up. We can see some upsets. But you look at the other team, like I mentioned, in the Penguins. Speaking about injuries, they have been riddled since the very beginning of the regular season up until the postponement of the season. There was a lot of key injuries in their lineup. Fortunately, their depth got them in position to be a 5 seed. But this is a team that's getting healthy, and we're going to see a lot of guys that are at 100%. We're usually, by the time the playoffs roll around, guys are battling injuries. They're fighting through it. They're using the grit that hockey players possess. But we're going to see a lot of fast, hungry, aggressive skaters out there that are good to go. They're not suffering any hampering injuries that could hold them back. They are as perfect as can be. It's kind of like they're coming straight out of training camp. It's like the beginning of the regular season. It's like a whole new year, it feels like. And I think that that's going to show dividend on the level of play that we're able to see. Obviously, this is something that has to actually go through. They have to get the right to play. But should we see that, that's hands down my biggest takeaway, because who knows what teams are going to shock early on in that first round, because I could see a ton of upsets because of reasons like that. My thoughts on this are I love this scenario. Obviously, as a fan of the game, I want to see hockey return alongside all sports. But the biggest thing with this is this proposal isn't anything new. We've seen this for quite some time. This proposal was made a very long time ago. We're talking about a couple months ago. Like when the first postponement of the season happened, this was a scenario that was starting to float around the league. It was starting to gain a little bit of steam. I wasn't on board at first because I just wanted the regular season to return. Of course, that was early on. That was when I thought, the season was going to get postponed for a little while, and they're going to return. They're going to have the regular season. They're going to finish the year like we're used to seeing every single year. But obviously, things continued to get pushed in the wrong direction. All of a sudden, here we are today, and it's the most realistic option. Regular season return just didn't seem realistic, and sure enough, they have a proposal that does not involve it. They have a proposal that I think is going to do a good job of replacing it. It's going to make things different. This is something we've never seen before, and it's going to give new life, like I mentioned, to some playoff teams, and could definitely, some of these teams could crash the party and definitely rough up some things and rough up some feathers in this scenario, being that there's teams that most likely would not have been in a position to do so had this not occurred. But overall, I like it because obviously I'm an advocate for any scenario that brings the game back. I want to see the guys back out on the ice and competing for a championship, because the team has to be crowned a champion at the end of a season. I can't stress that enough. That was like with the March Madness tournament. It really was such an empty feeling just seeing these guys battle it out all year with no end result. So I'm a fan of it. I think that there's a good chance it'll happen because the biggest step is getting it past the players. Because if the players and the ownership are all in sync and they're on the same page, that's a perfect scenario. You can't ask for much more. It's just going to come down to all the different state regulations. That's going to factor in the location that they play at, and just ultimately seeing how this gets figured out, being that there are Canadian teams and they're all also teams from the United States with the National Hockey League. So that there's got to be a fine balance between both Canada and the United States, because from what I've heard, the proposal would involve either all United States, certain locations throughout the country, or in Canada. I've heard a variety of them, a lot of different articles contradicting each other. So that's what makes this all a very interesting situation to me. But long story short, I think it could work. It's going to come down to logistics. It's going to be very difficult to make it all happen. But I think that the biggest check marks on those boxes have been checked, and that's the players are on board. That's one. The owners are on board. That's two. Now they just got to get that final step so they can successfully go through, because should it, I think it's going to be a very, very fun time. I can't wait to watch the games. Should it return, I don't want to jinx it. Knock on wood, of course. But I think that they've made great progress, and I think that there could be a domino effect with this, because I think that other leagues are going to see this is a huge step in the right direction. They're going to learn from it. They're going to examine it. I don't know if this is going to have an immediate impact, and if the NBA and the MLB are going to find a way to make it work on their end. I know that the NBA is in a more Similar situation being that their season runs along line the NHL. It's a very similar pattern. It's only distanced a couple days to a week, so I think that they're on a very similar time schedule. So I think that should the NHL find a way to return, we can see the same thing from the NBA and maybe even the MLB. So I think that this is all really good stuff, and I was thrilled when I saw this news, and one can only hope as a sports fan that it will lead to something better. But thanks again for watching this video, and make sure to check out some of my other videos on this channel, and make sure to follow Beyond the Sport at Instagram. It's an account where I post different videos breaking down different things. I do announcements for breaking news involving the world of sports, obviously. When something big happens like this, I was able to get that out the day of. I always try and do it as recently as I can so I can update you guys. But make sure to give it a follow because there's bonus content. I do Instagram live sessions. I was actually unable to this week, and I apologize for that, but I can't wait for next week because there's going to be so much more to talk about. And that's all I have to say, but thanks again. Have a good one.